Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Tae-sang-mi. 68.5 million. That's the staggering number of people who have been forcibly displaced worldwide as of today. The most sought-after destination for those fleeing from conflict or persecution is Europe, and there is growing debate across the continent on how to handle this influx of asylum seekers. On today's episode, we take a look at Europe's refugee crisis and where it stands now. Today with me in the studio is Boudewijn Walraven, Distinguished Visiting Professor at Sungkyunkwan University.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Before we move on, let's play a short clip.
Refugees have become a major bone of contention in Europe. On June 10th, the ship Aquarius, carrying 629 African migrants rescued at sea, were turned away by Italy and Malta. The French government condemned Italy over its refusal to take in the stranded migrants, calling the decision cynical and irresponsible. The situation escalated further when Italy summoned the French ambassador to protest and demanded an official apology.
Il y a là la preuve d'une forme de cynisme et d'une part d'irresponsabilité du gouvernement italien face à cette situation humanitaire dramatique.
Che spero e penso dia le scuse ufficiali nel più breve tempo possibile sono state usate nelle ultime ore.
After more than a week at sea, the rescue ship finally reached land in the Spanish port of Valencia on June 17. But the diplomatic row between Italy and France continued. French President Emmanuel Macron said he favored imposing sanctions on EU states that refuse to accept migrants.
On ne peut pas avoir des pays qui bénéficient massivement de la solidarité de l'Union européenne et qui revendiquent massivement leur égoïsme national lorsqu'il s'agit des sujets migratoires.
EU asylum rules called the Dublin Regulations stipulate that refugees apply for asylum in the first country they reach. But as the majority of refugees heading to Europe arrive in Italy or Greece through the Mediterranean Sea or the Balkan Peninsula, the two countries argue the regulation puts an unfair burden on them. In particular, Italy is taking a tough stance against refugees after its anti-migrant right-wing party formed a coalition government with the Populist Party. Hungary, a vocal opponent of the EU's mandatory migrant quotas, recently passed the Stop Sorrows law that makes helping asylum seekers a criminal offense. The refugee issue has caused internal disputes within the ruling party in Germany, a country that opened its borders to more than 1 million refugees in 2015 alone. The UN Refugee Agency estimates that more than 1,000 refugees have died crossing the Mediterranean Sea this year. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we take a look at possible reasons behind growing anti-refugee sentiment in Europe.
First off, Professor, what's the global definition of refugees and who is eligible for this status?
There's largely a division between people who flee conditions like war or violence and people who flee their place of origin because of economic reasons. And the latter actually are usually not included in the definition of regular migrants, although of course you might debate whether economic reasons are not a valid reason maybe to leave your own country. But basically it's people who flee conditions like war, not people just looking for a better life in another country.
Right, I think it's important here to note the difference between refugees and migrant or undocumented migrants, immigrants. And so I heard that there are people who are crossing into Europe illegally, seeking this refugee status. So wouldn't this actually hurt those people who are actual asylum seekers?
Yeah, to begin with, maybe the term undocumented migrants is not so valid because especially people who flee war, they may not have time to look for proper documentation. So, but anyway, there are the basic differences between people who come for economic reasons and the people who are really fleeing from violence in many different forms. And there is, in a certain sense, a danger although you may, I mentioned this before, also ask whether the people who leave their country for economic reasons might not be dealt with kind of leniently. But the first priority, of course, is people who flee war and conditions like that from countries like Syria and Yemen. The sheer numbers actually are staggering. Even the sheer numbers actually of the people who are certainly to be considered to be proper refugees. It's difficult to cope with for the neighboring countries and also for the other countries where these people eventually want to go.
And so there has been this refugee issue the whole time in Europe. It's been some time that this was an issue, right? But back when you were in the Netherlands, your home country, was this also an issue? And what is the reason behind this accepting and rejecting refugees?
In the Netherlands, actually, it has not been so much of a problem as in, for instance, Germany or in a country like Italy, which is really on the frontier. In a way, also this problem, or if in as much as it's a problem, is mixed with the influx of people who have come in quite legitimately. Yeah. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have quite a few people of Moroccan and Turkish origin. Their integration in some cases has not been optimal. And so some people are afraid actually that the Netherlands will be overrun by these people. These are wildly exaggerated fears, but politicians are apt sometimes of certain political parties especially to use this argument because it plays well with a certain group of people.
You just mentioned about Italy and Hungary. These are countries that have been taking hardline stance on refugee issues. And what do you think over time there has been anti-refugee sentiment in all around Europe? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's unfortunate there is this sentiment. I mean, it's not that there are no possible problems, but I think we should deal with it in a calm manner and also human manner, especially. A country like Italy, in a way, is in a special situation because Libya has turned into one kind of hub for migration to Europe. And the first country they can get to is Italy. So Italy has actually taken in quite a few migrants. That sometimes is a bit of a problem, and it certainly becomes a bigger problem when political parties like the Lega Nord in Italy, that's a kind of xenophobic party, uses this argument also to play on people's feelings and frightening people in a way also for what might happen. It is a real problem, I think. In fact, I think that to stop the migration from Sub-Saharan Africa, actually European policies are not necessary. But
you're saying that populist movements are using refugees as a government tool to win campaigns and...
I think this is, for instance, the case in Hungary. And in Hungary, of course, is also, it is in Central Europe, of course, but it is on the way of especially migrants from Greece, and they will come ultimately from Turkey and Syria and so on. So they had more direct influx of people than, for instance, a country like the Netherlands, where we are a bit more further away, so more isolated in that respect.
So lately, the Italian government turned away a rescue boat carrying hundreds of migrants, reigniting the international debate over refugees. We connect with an expert in Italy and in Switzerland after playing another short clip.
According to the UN Refugee Agency, the number of refugees worldwide had 68.5 million at the end of 2017, much higher than 50 million after World War II. Every day, 44,400 people are forcibly displaced. Where do refugees originate from, and where are they hosted? 2/3 of the world's refugees come from countries in the Middle East and Africa ravaged by civil war, dictatorship, or terror. Countries producing the highest number of refugees include Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Somalia. Refugees often relocate to neighboring countries. Turkey, which shares a border with Syria, tops the list of refugee-hosting countries in the world with 3.5 million refugees. However, their final destination is Europe. A survey released by the World Economic Forum shows that refugees prefer to resettle in European countries that have advanced economies and high standards of living. Since it opened its doors to refugees in 2015, Germany has accepted the highest number of asylum seekers in Europe, followed by France and Italy. Last year, about 70% of the 170,000 refugees who crossed the Mediterranean Sea into Europe landed in Italy. Faced with a growing influx of refugees, Italy is refusing to let migrant rescue ships dock and strongly calling for EU's refugee relocation quotas. We connect with an expert in Italy to learn more about the situation. We also talked to the International Organization for Migration about why, against all the odds, countries need to accept refugees.
We now have John Fanti on the line, an advisor at the Guarini Institute for Public Affairs at John Cabot University. John, pleased to have you on. Welcome.
Hi, Samir. Good to be here with you.
Right, John. Recently, the Italian government has turned away the rescue ship that was coming in to dock in the country. So what is the sentiment, the Italian public sentiment on this?
Okay. Yes, the Italian people have been divided as a public opinion, split 60-40, 60 in favor of turning back these ONG ships full of migrants that over the past couple of years, the perception was that it's getting out of control. 40% are more tolerant and say we should give humanitarian first aid and sort out who has the right to stay as an asylum seeker under the Geneva Convention and who needs to be turned back. And this is a very complicated process.
Right, we were just talking with our professor here about the populist governments in Europe. So we know that in Italy there is a new populist government. Do you think this is indicative of this new government's policy towards refugees?
Okay, I think that public opinion did not change because of the new government, which is just in place for 2 months. Public opinion sentiment has been building up over the last 4 or 5 years. Italian people have been very generous and very hospitable, and this has been recognized by everybody in Europe, but they felt that Italy was left alone, as Angela Merkel from Germany and Juncker from Brussels have recognized. So public sentiment has been building up, and this new populist government, indeed, they had an election campaign on these issues, and they were rewarded by it. However, even the prior government started to adopt changes to the immigration situation, but it was too late for them, and they were caught unprepared 5 years ago, like most of Europe was, by this influx of migrants, which I should add has followed the collapse of the Libyan government. Okay, let's keep that in the background. 7, 8 years ago, the Libyan government collapsed. There's a civil war, and the country is in the hands of gangs and sometimes organized crime and human traffickers, which are profiting from sending migrants to the coast of Europe.
And John, what are some social issues related to refugees in Italy and other European countries?
It's getting more and more serious. But if I just make a point about Europeans didn't expect the Libyan government to collapse, I should just say that some European countries were the reason and the cause of the collapse of the Libyan government, because they were advocating a regime change. It was a brutal dictatorship indeed, but it proves the point that you cannot force regime change without having a proper transition in place. Now, going back to the point of the social impacts of migration, I tell you, it's huge, because Western Europe over the last decades have developed an infrastructure of welfare society. You know, you have public free healthcare, you have subsidized public transportation, you have a free education, and etc., etc. when you put millions of people, hundreds of thousands in each country of poor people, they just overwhelm your public services, and the local population feel the competition with the new migrants, and unfortunately public sentiment changes if you don't manage it correctly.
Right, John, you just mentioned about the Libyan government, and Europe has been divided on this issue of refugees. So what are some of the things that Italy is doing and some other European countries are doing to fix this problem?
What the Italy government is trying to do is to have a European-wide debate on how to handle this migration. Italy, together with Greece and other Mediterranean countries like Spain, would like other European countries to take a share of these refugees. And back in 2015, the prior government reached an agreement with all the European countries to share the burden. Okay, each country, France, Germany, and Spain agreed to take 9,000, 10,000, 15,000 refugees. To date, none of them lived up to those commitments. So there's a great frustration. And they didn't do that because their public opinion doesn't like to have more refugees in. Unfortunately, what I think is that we are infighting among ourselves in Europe about who takes more share of the refugees, which is only 10% of the problem. So we are fighting about a solution to 10% of the problem, while the remaining 90% of the problem is the economic migration, the clandestine migration, out of control, and that will not be solved by arguing among ourselves, but we should work with the North African countries to stop this influx and work with the origin countries of these poor people, help them develop their economy in some way and prevent them from migrating, because there are hundreds of millions of people in sub-Saharan Africa that have declared that they will be willing, 50% of them declare they're willing to come to Europe. So it will be unmanageable over the next few years.
Now we link up with Leonard Doyle, spokesperson of the International Organization for Migration, based in Geneva, Switzerland. Good to see you, Leonard.
Hi, Sangmi. How are you?
Hi, Leonard. Do you agree with the assessment that refugees cause social problems in Europe?
I think that's a bit of a stretch. No group of human beings is perfect, but I think the number of refugees creating trouble in comparison to their numbers in Europe is tiny, infinitesimal. But they tend to get blamed for everything, though, which is pretty understandable human reaction. Well, it's easy to scapegoat somebody from another society. I think that's well understood in Korea, as it is in anywhere in the world. People who are foreigners tend to be seen as the other. That's where the expression xenophobia comes from. Xenos, the fear of the other. And it's been happening in human society since time immemorial. So nothing is surprising that people are treating the other, i.e. the migrants, and suspecting them. And of course, some migrants do stupid things and do criminal things, but by no means a majority. Are you kidding? They're usually very hardworking and very well behaved.
So Leonard, tell us why the European countries should be accepting these hundreds of migrants and refugees.
Well, are you talking about migrants or refugees? It's an important question, because those who are coming in who are assessed to be refugees, well then it's not only should the Europeans be accepting them, they have to accept them under international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions, which is the convention of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, requires that anyone assessed as a refugee be accepted. But if you mean migrants rather than refugees, and I think you do, then that's a different question, because many of those have needs to be protected. They may have been mistreated on the way by smugglers. There could be women who are pregnant. They might be victims of trafficking. Of course they need protection. But those who fall into the category of irregular migrants, or as is commonly said in the media, illegal migrants, then I'm afraid they're usually out of luck. and they are often not allowed to stay in the country.
Leonard, then what happens to those who are not allowed to stay there?
Well, in Europe, there is, luckily, a very good and healthy legal system, and it is possible for lawyers to make appeals and to delay the process of deportation or refusal almost indefinitely in some cases. So it's difficult for Europe to manage its affairs, given that there are so many expert lawyers making it difficult for them. And this in turn creates problems politically, because if the public believe that it's out of control, then they start voting against the politicians, and the politicians who want to get elected start making very inflammatory statements about migrants. So you have a very kind of toxic result, which is that instead of managing it better, they manage it worse.
Thank you too for your insights. That was John Fanti from Rome, Italy, and Leonard Doyle from Geneva, Switzerland. Now, Professor, your insights, your comments on those two experts' comments, what do you think about that?
I would agree maybe more with Leonard Doyle about the impact of the refugees, the actual impact. I think the European countries generally are quite capable, although maybe some problems, but quite capable of dealing with the situation. Sometimes also there is the argument that the country is full. We can't have any more people, but a country like Germany, for instance, in recent years has had a decreasing population, and the number of people who have come in are not even enough to make up for that. So I think they can deal with it. And I agreed quite a bit with John Fanti when he said that actually there is a pressing problem, which is not how to deal with the people who are already on the boats now and so on, but what do we do in stopping this flow of people? Because I think in that case the European Union especially has to think about its policies, which make it more difficult sometimes for African countries to export agricultural products to the European Union, and makes in that sense the economic life in these sub-Saharan countries more difficult. For instance, George Soros has formulated a plan to put a lot of money into these countries, $30 billion or euros, I can't remember exactly, but quite substantial sum, but not outrageously big actually, especially with the thought of improving the economy of these countries, and so in that way stopping the flow where it begins, and rather than addressing the problem once these people reach the shores of the Mediterranean.
As the two experts were talking about, improving the countries where the refugees actually come from is definitely going to be the solution in a long term. But in a short term, in a very prompt way to solve this issue, what do you think there will be?
In the short term, I think it should be said again and again that certainly the refugees, not the economic migrants, but the refugees have a right, and we as human beings actually, and not only as human beings, but also if we follow international law, we're obliged to help them, and we have to have sensible procedures to do it. And it might, for some countries, actually also be useful to think of the past. Actually, in Germany also there's some pushback at the moment among the Alternative für Deutschland, so this party which doesn't want more influx of migrants. In Germany, actually, they have coped earlier with an enormous influx of people who were fleeing, refugees. These were Germans who lived in what now is Poland or even Russia and Czechoslovakia and so on. And actually, at that time, the right-wing party, CSU, that threatens now to break with Merkel, at that time made a kind of poster, we warmly welcome you, we give you homes and so on. And actually, it would be wonderful if they could remember that it can happen to anyone. So, and even if these people happen to speak very different languages and they come from far away, may have a different religion, maybe also that plays a role. I think actually that still they're human and we are obliged to assist them.
Right. I think it's very important to remember to be humanitarian when dealing with this refugee and migrant issues, especially this is actually not just a problem in Europe. It is actually all around the world, in the United States and in Asia as well. So I think people and countries should really take responsibility and share the burden.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for your expertise today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, this is where we wrap things up for now. We will be back with another global hot issue next week. Thank you for watching.